I'm going to introduce this panel really quickly. I'm Jessica Powers, founder and publisher at Catalyst Press. This is our 7th annual Reading Africa campaign, in which we invite people all over the world, booksellers, readers, writers, publishers, people that love African literature, to post what they're reading and to do these events. And so we're really excited for the first live event of this year's Reading Africa campaign, and that is from Nairobi to New York, Kenyan Writers on the Rise. I'm simply going to introduce Dr. Lizzy Attree, who's our moderator, and then she will introduce the panelists and take it from there. So Dr. Lizzy Attree is the co-founder of the Mabati-Cornell Kiswahili Prize for African Literature, and she's the UK director of the Short Story Day Africa, which has published multiple anthologies of short stories by African writers from around the continent. And we're really pleased to have Dr. Lizzy Attree moderating this event. Thank you. Lizzy, if you can take it from here.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks so much for asking me to do this. I'm joining you from London, and I'm looking forward to speaking with my 3 panelists this evening. Reading Africa is a great opportunity to have a conversation about different trends in writing, but also just to talk with friends about their work and to encourage you all to look beyond your usual reading lists to find work by all of these writers. I'm here with Khadija Bajaber from Mombasa, Kiprop Kimutai from Nairobi, and Carey Baraka, who I think is in Kenya at the moment, unless you're in the US, I'm not sure.
Kenya, I'm in Nairobi.
Yeah. You're in Nairobi, okay. So everybody on the continent, welcome. I put the panel together so that we could look at nascent writing, I guess. People hate that word, upcoming writers, but I feel like all 3 of you fit that category quite well. Khadija has a novel that's House of Rust, which I have here. I don't know if you can see it, which was published, that's my copy anyway, after winning the Graywolf Press Prize, which was judged by Igoni Barrett. She is also published in Enkare Review, A Long House, Lolwe, Down River Road, all really exciting journals, even if Enkare is now defunct, amongst other publications. She was an associate editor at Sahifa Journal, and the debut novel House of Rust was published to great acclaim. I think some of the best descriptions I've ever seen or read about the Mombasa coast, and the key character Aisha, who goes on a journey into the sea and experiences all kinds of magical adventures with her talking cat buddy. Kiprop is a Nairobi-based writer who I first met in Ghana, I think, on a Cane Prize workshop. He's been writing stories that have been published in Jacana, with Kwani Trust, the Jalada Africa project, Painted Bride Quarterly, amongst others, Kachifo. And he's recently been selected as a Miles Moreland Scholar. So he has a book, a manuscript that he's working on now, which we'll talk about today. And Carey Baraka, I know from, he edited a story of mine, actually, that was published in Enkare Review some years ago. And he's a writer himself who's writing journalism, writing about literary culture, food and politics, amongst other things. His works appeared in The Guardian in the UK, Literary Hub, the Johannesburg Review of Books, Foreign Policy, Gay Magazine, amongst others. And he's been on the Iowa Writers Program, I think, as well as being a fellow at the MacArthur Colony. And I'm just really looking forward to bringing you all together to talk about some of the things that you might share in common, some of your differences, obviously, as well, different styles of writing, different ways of approaching writing. Yeah, I'm just also hoping you can tell us about your works in progress, if it's not too much of a secret. I noticed, Carey, that you have a novel manuscript hiding in your desk somewhere, which perhaps you want to share a bit about. So let's start with Khadija, I think, ladies first. I was excited to read your novel, especially because I haven't read much fiction from the Mombasa coast, and it's so infused with the Hadrami culture and Kiswahili pieces of information and literature sort of woven in with the stories. I wondered how you went about writing the novel. What was your inspiration?
My inspiration was I needed to. Oh, did you lose me?
Your screen has gone blank. Yeah,
Okay, let me try again.
but
No.
we can still hear you.
Okay. Well, I was not doing very well with my long projects, and I realized that was probably because I wasn't really writing from home. So I decided to correct that and to kind of approach a story project that draws from my experiences as a local here and the culture here, and just try and give Mombasa its moment, I guess, in fiction, which was fun. It was a project for me to do, and it had its challenges, but I think I really enjoyed getting to kind of fall back in love with my city again. So that's kind of why I wrote the book. And yeah, I guess the rest is history. And today for the prize, and got it published, and yeah, I'm really grateful.
I'm glad you're back on our screens. You also said in an interview recently that lots of people contacted you afterwards with sort of stories and information that they wanted to share because, again, I think you sparked something in people who hadn't really seen that kind of writing before. Can you tell us a bit about the things people came up with?
I think it was in regards to getting basically cultural insights or history insights into Mombasa. There's writers who are already writing in Mombasa who are kind enough to reach out to me and kind of like bring me into the fold, because I'd been writing quietly by myself for a long time. And two of those writers were people like Abdurrahman Degwa, who writes under the name Abu Amira, and Lubna Abdul Halim. And through that, I got, I was getting more and more into um, into not the network necessarily, but into the conversation with other people about what is Mombasa, what's the history, how do people feel about it, how do we feel about like how we talk about our stories and such. So that was really rewarding, and through that just continued on. Like I met people like Hawa Noor. I met a professor called Dr. Salwa Salim the other day, who had written a paper about the Yemeni Arabs in the coast of East Africa, Mombasa. Like, and I read that paper ages ago, back when I was in university, in like 2014 or something, and it was really nice to kind of interact with this stuff as like a living breathing thing rather than just from my imagination and from my perspective, and it's been rewarding. And like people like Hawa Noor, I think they run this website called Historia or Historia. It's which is basically curating a lot of information about the Swahili community, about the coast of Kenya, and it's been, yeah, it's just been really nice getting to kind of like know more. I wrote what I knew. I knew what I didn't. I knew how much I didn't know, and the gap will never close, obviously. But it's been really nice, kind of getting more into it. Yeah, so that's what I meant by kind of the book um, doing that, I guess. And also because I think people weren't really used to having that kind of news from writers from Mombasa, like as in someone who's from here being recognized outside of Mombasa, which was really, really, really nice. But I was grateful for how people reacted to the news. People were very encouraging, very proud, and I really just wanted, I really hoped that I can hopefully be able to take in all that goodness and be able to, I don't know, keep writing in a way that honors the people who were so happy for me. So yeah,
it's great that it's
the long
sort of, yeah, leading to like a blossoming of interest, but also maybe more stories to come. I'm loving that you have a lot of post-it notes on your shelves behind you. I'm imagining all of your urgent tasks stacking up behind you. Do you think there's another thing you said in an interview that you didn't think there was much distinction between Mombasa writing and Nairobi writing? You felt like Kenyan writing was a very distinct kind of identity that you could see in many of your fellow writers. Do you want to say something more about that?
I mean, it's not the same, because obviously different cities feel different people feel different. But what I do notice in Kenyan writing, whether someone is writing from Nairobi or from Mombasa, I think Kisumu, Iten, is that there is a charismatic kind of it's charming. I think I don't know, I said that in an interview, but what I meant is that it's hard for me necessarily to kind of pinpoint what it is, but when I read Kenyan writing, I can tell this is Kenyan writing. I don't know how really to describe that.
That's a challenge. Perhaps we'll put that to Carey then. Is that something you pick up in your readings, or do you feel like there are distinctions?
I did not expect that question to be put to me.
Sorry.
Of course, like a part of like the challenge that like whenever I read like Kenyan writing, I already know that it's Kenyan writing.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not like I'll have like the sense of Kenyan. I already know that like the writer is Kenyan, right?
You don't blindfold yourself first and then choose a book.
Sorry?
I said you don't blindfold yourself first and then choose a book. I suppose it's all there on the cover.
No, yeah, I guess I don't know that. But I mean, there's a way that like certain like stories end up being similar, right? Like say, a person could very like, even if you didn't know the identity of the writers, you could tell that like say like the person wrote House of Rust, and the person who wrote the Dragonfly Sea, and the person who wrote like the story that won the Kane Prize last year are from the same sort of cultural context. Yeah, and if you like search out like all the writers, you can tell that like the person who wrote like I mean, people writing in the 80s and 70s, Mailu, Meja Mwangi, etc., could sort of like trace a similar backdrop, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, it's Lufumio is also similar generation, which also makes a difference when she won the Kane Prize last year. There are elements of kind of magical realism as well in those sort of coastal stories, I think, which link them, but perhaps aren't as common in Nairobi stories. Could you say that might be the case?
I mean, yeah, there's I don't think it's just that, because like even a novel like Things They Lost by Okuyo Dor has a lot of like sort of like the magical realist elements, and also like very similar protagonists, right? But I think, say like with House of Rust, it's not like the magical realism that like makes it like a Mombasa novel, for instance. Is that like it's like there's a way Kenyans talk about majini, genes from Mombasa, that like is in Khadija's book, that isn't in like say like Yvonne's book. Yeah. I'm really struggling with this question because I did not you didn't warn me they're going to ask me this. This is like analysis.
Don't worry. We can ask Kiprop as well, because I know Kiprop likes to put some magic into his stories from manuscripts I've written. And actually, when we were in Ghana, you did write a mermaid story, but it had a lot to do with heroin as well, and the the kind of problems on the coast in Malindi and elsewhere. And I thought that was a really interesting combination of kind of social realism and magic at the same time. Can you tell us, Kiprop, what your take is on Kenyan writing, or your writing as well, please?
Also, first of all, thank you. I'm happy to be on this panel, and thanks to everybody who's attended and who's here to listen to us. I don't take that lightly. So to your question about, I agree with everything that Khadija and Carey are saying about Kenyan literature and Kenyan writing. It's very specific, maybe because we share one cultural matrix, we have like the shared experiences and whatnot. You can definitely tell this is a Kenyan sound. There's a flavor to it. It's just not like Kenyan English is so distinct, and I'm not speaking about the accent or the intonation. Or there's just a choice of vocabulary, a way of looking at your world, and I think that spills over to our writing. So I can definitely tell this is a Kenyan, like just from the way they approach their story. And I guess the best, for me, obviously I cannot prescribe, but I think the best example of a book that showcases how Kenyan language is Binyavanga's memoir. One day I will write about this place. There's a sprinkling of that on when I read other people's works, but I'm not going to presume that they were influenced by Binyavanga, but I can see the relation. And what about magic? I would say, in general, if I'm to go back to our cultural matrix, it's when people are going about their life, the ordinary and the everyday, the ways of understanding the world that we take for granted that might seem a little magical to somebody else. So maybe I can maybe call it a Kenyan traditional magic of some sort, if I can even use the word magic. And it's the kind of stories that you hear when you're along the beach and you're talking to somebody, or you're somewhere hanging out with people. Like, they're all these fascinating tales that are quite magical, but they're taken as, they're readily accepted by almost everybody, despite
like night runners.
Despite how pragmatic they are, I would say so. So I like when I see it in our writing, because it's it's like I'm capturing what the conversations that are happening out there and just putting it on the page, making it matter on the page.
I think, yeah, perhaps there's also just a bolder approach. I don't think anyone seems to feel the need to explain any of that anymore, which I think is really refreshing. So maybe that pairs with the idea of just a kind of confidence that's coming through, as well as sort of taking for granted certain cosmological realities, which in the past might not have come through because people were much more focused on politics and social realist kinds of writing. Can you tell us about the manuscript you hope to write with them?
Oh, the Miles Morland. So I pitched, obviously I'm not going to say a lot about it because it's still in that sacred place where it's forming, and I don't want to spoil the process or to anger the gods of who summoned me to write that novel. But it's historical fiction, basically, because I grew up listening to lots of stories from my elders. I'm from Elgeyo Marakwet, Iten, and it's near the edge of the Rift Valley, a section of the Rift Valley called the Kerio Valley. And my ancestors, from maybe my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather onwards, lived on the edge of the escarpment. And they sort of just, it's a fascinating life. It was a frugal and very difficult life because they were surrounded by the Maasai and the Karamojong and the Nandi, because the Rift Valley area was very volatile based on which community held power at a particular point in time and kind of forced the other communities from the more livable areas. So I just wanted to step back into that time because I have those stories in me. I just want to go back to 1850 or it's not even a specific time, but I want to go back to the 19th century, to the experience of a family living along the Kerio Valley, and to sort of look at the fractures and fissures that were happening at that time, especially because it was at that time that Europe really took an interest in that particular region. And it was at that particular time that explorers were coming from Britain and Germany and Scotland to kind of try and map out that region. So I'm very fascinated by the expeditions of explorers during that time. I'm going to write about a specific explorer, a real life explorer. I'm not going to mention him right now. And how his expedition collides with the dramas this family is experiencing as they live along the Kerio Valley. So I just want to sort of imagine what it was like to be an African in the 19th century, because in many ways, we are not supposed to go that far back when it comes to imagining ourselves. And it's not even that far back. It's just literally like less than 200 years ago, but it's sort of, there's a kind of suggestion that our experience begins with colonialism, but there was obviously life before that. And it is recorded. I'm not going to say that I'm
great
the first
about
person to do. Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about Peter Kimani's Jacaranda dance and looking at the building of the railway and how he kind of takes that back historically into the early part of the 1900s. And the same with Kintu. It sort of undermines the idea that, yeah, things began with the white man, and actually just excludes the British almost completely from that novel, which is again bold and sort of refreshing. Carey, can you tell us a bit about your take on creative writing? You're known much more for your journalistic pieces, long form journalism that I've read anyway, in newspapers and elsewhere. What's your approach to writing fiction? Is it contemporary, or does it go into this historical period as well?
A way of answering this would say that, like, the novel I started working on while I was at McDowell last year is historical, but not as far back as Kiprops or like as Chintu. But like, so like there's a thing I think about with like nonfiction and fiction, where it's much easier to write nonfiction than it is to write like fiction, right? Because like with nonfiction, everything you're writing about has already happened. Like everything, the story is already there. Like the characters are already there. They exist. All you have to do is like do like maybe some archival research, interview people, but like everything is set in stone already, right? You just like have to like arrange it, but things already happened. And I remember like there's like an interview, I think it's John Didion, where she says like the very same thing about like fiction and nonfiction, where she says she finds writing fiction much harder because you have to like come up with like the story by yourself. You have to come up with like the characters by yourself. You have to come up with like everything. Yeah, and I think like that's like something that I struggle with, because like say like with this novel, you set like a lot of it is concerned with like Kampala in the 1960s, and especially like that, like the sort of cultural and literary world of Kampala, with like transition, with like the people in Enkare, with everything that's happening in Kampala in that in that time. And it's this, really difficult thing of, if it was like nonfiction, you just have to see whatever happened and like, that's the story, right? But then like with fiction, having to come up with like the story, having to like come up with like, oh, this character connects to this character in this way, is always like, it's something that is like harder. I think that's something people don't appreciate, that like writing nonfiction is so easy, like fiction is like where all the struggle is.
That's interesting, because although that may be the case in terms of factual writing and reporting, it's true that there isn't much nonfiction that's published in Kenya, that I don't think really, if it does get published, it doesn't make it beyond like the local borders. And I think it's fairly hard to get right, as in, pull together into book form rather than just short pieces here and there. You'd also be in danger, wouldn't you, if you're in the 60s in Kampala, of depicting real people who were, with at Enkare, and would you bring in sort of professors and well-known kind of writers who were there?
I mean, yeah, that's what we were doing it. And then we would like to do like sort of what Thoreau did with this book about Nepal, where like, of course, like the book is about Nepal, but like a lot of the action takes place in Kampala, right? And he's talking about like all these people who, like, it's just like talking about the people who are there. Or even if someone was just to like be like, they're just going to use like transition. In between like the 1960s and like 1972, there are all these essays in transition about what was happening in that period, right? So even if you were to take like, I say, an essay by Barbara Nioji in 1972 about like the closure, the arrest of Rajat Nioji, like the story is already there, like everything is just like, it's there waiting for you. And so I think like what people usually struggle with like with nonfiction, and what I struggle with sometimes, is like when there's so much material, it's hard to like take a step back and like pinpoint, oh, this is important, this is not important, this works for the story, it doesn't work for the story, right? And I think like, say like what you're talking about, like with like, say like not a lot of like heavy nonfiction being published from Kenya, is that like that editorial process of the editorial process that like helps a writer really, really, really streamline their story, doesn't mostly exist with Kenyan publications, right? So you'll have like someone have an incredible story, but like because the editorial support isn't there, it will remain a hypothetical story, or it will be just like a draft that will never ever see the light of day.
I think that's probably one of the big losses of Kwani, is that lack of editorial, kind of somebody who's going to take the piece and then ask you questions and maybe strip it down a little bit. Khadija, you also said that that you started writing your book with one chapter on paper and the rest was told during a power cut. Was it to your mother?
Yeah. I think to my mother, and I think I'm not sure who else was there. I think my sister and maybe one or both of my brothers. I don't remember. It was dark and it was a long time ago. But yeah, KPLC power cuts are like a usual thing. Like everyone in Kenya knows, if it's not power, it's water. If it's not water, it's something else. So back in the day, that was before the automated like KPLC systems that they have nowadays. But it was very hot, and I had written the first chapter and it looked good, but I didn't know how to continue. And only when I was in that moment telling the story to my family, where I was kind of just had the confidence, I guess, to make it up on the spot and just let the story take me where it takes me. And yeah, that was a good experience. I hadn't thought of that before back then, about how to approach story in one format, and
I
then
quite like
kind
the
of
idea of using the oral.
yeah. So like, as in, it's so I think since then I've always been interested in kind of like when I am looking
I'm
at
still. I can't.
Sorry. Oh, did you lose me? Can you hear me now? Hello?
Hi, sorry,
Hello?
it might be my connection that you were breaking up quite a bit.
Oh, can anyone else hear me? Wait.
I can hear you now.
Hi. Okay. Okay.
You just
Sorry.
repeat what you
Well,
said.
basically, oh yeah. So I was saying that I think being able to kind of look at the story and kind of reapproach it through a different like format, or through using a different tool, and then come back to it and then work it into prose, was something I didn't realize I could do then, and which is something that's allowed me to look at story these days as more like a looser, and not as like rigid, like as in the story idea that I have, it could be a script, it could be a book, it could be a line of code, it could be a game, it could be anything. And that has been interesting and rewarding for me, looking at story, not just writing and literature, which is very important obviously, but through other means, and just enjoying it that way. Yeah.
That was, yeah, I was going to say that the sort of process of self-editing whilst telling a story in the moment is quite an interesting way to approach perhaps putting together, you know, the bare bones of something which you could then flesh out later. But the problem of too much material is a huge problem, especially I imagine with historical fiction. Did you have any sort of written sources to draw on, or did it all come from your own hearing of stories?
I think I researched like here and there, like I'd Google, I'd try and like find essays and something, but like it's not like I specifically like focused on a certain time. I just knew that it was taking place during the generation of my parents. So, and because like Kiprop said, we like listening to our elders. Our elders have stories all the time, and they're so nostalgic about the past anyway. So they're always saying stories. So it would be like in their stories, like touches of like the historical time period or what was happening in Kenya at that time. Example, one of the parts in the story, I mentioned how during sugar shortages, they put like peremende, or like I didn't use peremende the word then, but like, you know, a sweet in the tea, because even if they didn't have, you know, because the British were like controlling like the borders and how much sugar could come in. We used to smuggle sugar, so like I knew all those stories, like listening to the people around me, and I use that as in where I should sweeten the tea, the cat's tea, with the sweet, because even if they don't have sugar, they still have the candy. And I knew one of those stories because I knew that from one of my aunties, listening to her talk about her time actually in Kitui, how they used to kind of deal, like how were they making their homes, you know, because I mean, we can talk about like history and everything, but like you feel it like in your home, right? Like the president's changes, whatever it is, the policies are changing, but you feel it in your home, you feel it in your groceries, you feel it in how you're able to move, how you're able to kind of host, you know, your daily life. So I guess in terms of research, I did try and do research, like proper historical research, but it was difficult and I was very shy. So most of the detail about Mombasa is drawn from like I call it like a memory soup. So all the sources are just like everyone like I ever knew. And it's not like I asked them like, oh, tell me about this time so I can write in my book. No, I just remembered from my childhood and from growing up. So I guess it was that way. You know.
I love that's a great description, the memory soup. Presumably the talking cat wasn't anywhere in the archives either. And I always think of Bulgakov when I think of talking cats, but that's a much more villainous version in The Master and Margarita. Carey, do you have a soup that you draw from? What drew you to Uganda for your writing?
I guess like Uganda is cliche for anybody who's interested in like African literature. Because I mean, I've been obsessed with like African writers for like a long time. I think when I was a kid, I wanted to go to Ibadan. And then I switched and like wanted to go to Makerere for a while. And then I went to like UN, so completing like the circle of universities, right? Yeah, and so I've been interested in like Uganda for a long time. I mean, not obviously, but I used to be obsessed with Barbara Kimenye, particularly her Moses series, right? But then like more recently, I sort of got into, and part of it was triggered by when I did like the fellowship in Iowa. Khadija had done the fellowship just before me, and she was sort of like telling me what I need to do, what I don't need to do. And like one of the things she told me I need to do is like I need to like hang out with Peter Nazareth, who lives in Iowa. And so I go hang out with Peter Nazareth, and he's telling me all these stories about Kampala in the 60s, which are really, really fun, right? About himself, about Ngugi, about Bano Leong, about the Zirimus, about Rajat, about like all these people. And I think like what made me really sad was like the fact that like I hadn't heard of most of them, even though I pride myself in like, oh, I know they're African writers, but like I hadn't heard of like most of them. Yeah, and so like at that point became like sort of like a bit an obsession. I remember like when I wrote about Ngugi for The Guardian, we had like a bit of a problem where like they wanted it to be about Ngugi and I wanted to be more about Uganda. You know, I was like, let's talk about John Nagenda. Let's spend 5,000 words talking about Elvania Zirimu. Let's talk about like the house parties in Kololo. Yeah, and so yeah, this is like, and since then I've been like touching my friends with like stories about like all these people being like, have you read this essay by Nagenda? Like, do you know that like after Obote arrested Rajat Nyoji, wrote an essay about it? Have you read this essay about this? Have you read this? The essay about the person. Have you read like Barbara Kimenye profiling Barbara Brown before she was called Barbara Nyoji? Yeah, and so like it's like just have like try another novel, which is an excuse for me to like talk about all the like people in this era and in this like city who I'm obsessed with, right? Yeah.
But it won't be fan fiction, will it? Or will it be kind of controversial relationships between all of these people? I'm kind of imagining the soup could get quite kind of well, I don't know, incestuous after a while, you know, all the connections. You have to be careful with some people's histories and
yeah, yeah, of course, you have to do that. I'm trying to think of like a I'm trying to think of a novel. I'm sure like there are books which do this. I mean, someone like Teju Cole does this sort of thing where he writes like novels where like the characters obsess about like the things that he's obsessed with, right? So like whether you're obsessed about photographers or you have like all these like characters who like sit for a long time and talk about like novelists. And I think you have like a lot of like American literature, like characters sit and talk about like Bello or about like whichever like American writer. And I think one of the things that is drawing me is that like I want to have like a book where like characters sit and like have arguments about like African writers or like people in Ibadan or people in like in South Africa in the 70s, you know? And so like I guess it's very, very much fan fiction.
I like the idea of like canonizing those writers in a different way, kind of canonizing them as human beings, perhaps rather than as greats of African literature, you know, putting their kind of backroom chats into the public domain. I think that's a really interesting idea. People forget, you know, that they were teenagers or that they were in their 20s, and you know that sort of reality of living in Kampala would be really, really fascinating. Kiprop, can I ask you a bit again about archival research for your time period? Presumably in the Rift Valley, there isn't a great deal to draw on. Are you also drawing from oral history that you've been told as a child or you've looked into as an adult? How do you go about your research for your writing?
Oh, I hope you can hear me because my video is gone. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So the good thing is there's been a surge of historical fiction. So as I was saying earlier, following in the footsteps of my elders, like we have Lila Bulela, Petinagapa, Abdul Razak Gurna, Jennifer Makumbi. There are so many, even Benjamin Kipkorir, who was an anthropologist, he wrote a lot about the Rift Valley region. So I would say I have a template. I have people who came before me who've done it, who've created an interest for historical fiction. So I have many writers, fiction writers that I can draw from. And beyond that, there's an extensive archive. There's so much that's written about Africa in the 19th century. They're the recordings of the explorers themselves, but obviously they wrote it within a colonial cultural matrix. So my endeavor is to write beyond their biases. And for that, I'm leaning on the emotional truths that I was told by elders from my family, because I have stories carried down that my grandmother told me, and she was told by her grandmother about how they lived, about the events that happened, about weddings and wars and their joys, their grief, all that. There's just so much story. Like so many people I can turn to and just listen and imagine, create something that's honest to my ancestry and to being an African in the 19th century. So I'm not worried, like the spectacular authors as well. Like I'm surrounded, I have an army around me that will allow me to write this book.
That's a good, I like armies of storytellers. They're my favorite kinds of armies. I like the idea that all of you are kind of complicating the Kenyan story as well as the African literary story, and that we haven't had to even touch on the question of what is an African writer. One of the big rivalries that Kenya does sometimes come up against is this sort of East-West Africa bias, which I think, you know, there's a lot of writing coming from Nigeria that's definitely kind of taking off especially in the US as well as in the UK. Do you feel sort of at all threatened by that, or is it a very distinct rivalry that is only really for selling books, and kind of just in the minds of some marketing department somewhere?
I guess I'll go first. I did not know it was a rivalry. I didn't know it was a rivalry. I thought it was just like people writing from like different places. I think like one of the things I'm really jealous of about like Nigerian writing is there is a lot of like sort of critical argument about like what is like valid as a Nigerian fiction and Nigerian poetry. There's like this like essays called Oris, who wrote an essay about like, I think he was arguing that like Nigerian fiction is dead because like all the Nigerian fiction writers are living in the US and existing in like MFA programs, right? And then like someone else wrote something else, like pointing out how Oris was wrong. Someone else wrote something else supporting Oris. A fourth person wrote something else. And I think like I'm really jealous that like say like that happens in Nigeria. I wish that happened in Kenya, you know?
You wish there was more rivalry.
No, because it's not quite rivalry. It's like it's people actually giving like it's honest intellectual debate about like what should be written about, how they should write about it, what sort of stories they should tell.
Okay, that makes sense. Khadija.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with what Carey is saying. It's not necessarily that there's a rivalry, but it's impressive. Nigerians are constantly in conversation with the work that is currently happening for Nigerians. Like they're constantly talking about it, discussing it. You know, it's in the present like imagination, like and they take fiction so like seriously. You know, they really these pieces, and I like West African literature a lot, and I think I don't necessarily think of it as a concern or like anything, you know. I've been very much pleased to be writing as a Kenyan and kind of like appealing to Kenyans as my audience, and like, you know, kind of we're doing us, like, as an, I guess, which is what we've been doing for the past, you know, decades. Like, you know, I think West African fiction is definitely also has a lot of like I think in general in the Western market, like the west of the world, or the when they think about African fiction, they do tend to think about West Africa a lot, which is fine. But I always like to see, like when I see competitions and, you know, short lists and everything, like you'll see like 8 out of 10 West Africans, and then like 2 East Africans, and I feel very happy. And that's all. And I'm good with where we are. You know, we're here.
True. I think there's always a lot of noise, you know, and I think maybe that is something that's missing is the critical culture, and there's not much space for it in the newspapers. And I wondered what you thought about, and I can ask this to Kiprop and all of you really, but magazines like Lolwe and Downriver Road, and whether they are kind of filling some of the space that Kwani left behind or doing something different. Do you think there's enough of that kind of publication, or is there still like a big space needed for more of that?
I'm really proud of every Kenyan who's creating an outfit to produce our stories. And I'm happy if there can be more. So I don't want to speak so much about the industry. I would rather just be the writer who writes as much as I can when I can, and support the ecosystem, and obviously as the noble endeavor of creating a framework for producing our stories. I'll always be in support of that, but I don't want to make a major pronouncement about it. I don't think I'm in a position to do that, but applause to everybody who's creating the mechanisms to produce our stories. Like I'll keep uploading them.
I think, well, for me, I think that when I came into, writing more and trying to look for publishing my pieces, I came at a really rich time. And I think it was between 2012 and 2015, like those days, like literary mags were popping up from Kenya, and people were establishing kind of like infrastructure, like it was, and that led to some really great writing and some really great magazines. And yeah, but I think also a lot of people, when they think of Kenyan literature, it's kind of like like they look at literature and they're like, we're all living in some kind of like post-Kwani world, and I don't know if I necessarily look at the Kenyan writing scene there, like in that way. Kwani is very important, and did a lot, and is a huge part of the Kenyan literary history. But I think a lot of people, when they look at Kenyan literature, like they're looking at the literature and the infrastructures like we kind of have now as like this is post Kwani, which I don't think. I don't know. I don't think it's quite how I feel about it, I guess. I don't know, not a very articulated opinion, just thoughts.
Carey, what do you think?
I'll just like I say like the same thing Kiprop said about yeah, it feels really good to like see all these people who want to do the work of setting up these platforms, because like it's not easy. And it's also like this thing of, I think the first time I had like a story published, I think I was 19, and it was in Jalada, and yeah, like I can never forget how excited I was to be like, because I'd read Jalada and like, oh, this writer called who, and this other writer called who, and there's like Kiprop Kimutai, who has a short story called Kiprop has a story called The Gentleman from Iten, which I really, really loved. And then I was publishing Jalada, and it felt really, really gratifying that like, oh, I'm also liking these spaces. And I think that's like what all these platforms do, whether it's like Downriver Road or like Lolwe or like whichever. It's like we'll have like some other writer will be published there for the first time, and they'll get this sense of like, I'm also a writer, which is a wonderful feeling to have.
All right. I'm just going to open it up to the audience. We have some people watching, which is great. And I've asked for questions. Has anyone got a question they want to set to Kiprop or Khadija or Carey. Oh, one has come up here from Emmanuel, who's at the University of California, Riverside. She says she likes Lehumio's theme of hair in her story, 5 Years Next Sunday. She just downloaded it and is going to read it soon. And she's interested in hair in Francophone African literature. Does anyone have that interest in hair? I know it's come up in Chimamanda's work before.
But I not necessarily, but I love Itzalu's work. Like, she's one of my favorite writers as well. She's also from Coast. And like Carey said, like, you know, you'd read these guys in literary mags, in online publications, and then you finally write and you get your work published there. So you get that full circle moment. And Itzalu was definitely one of those people that I was reading before I ever got published. And it was, yeah, yeah, she's an amazing writer. Basically, that's what I wanted to say.
It can be quite inspirational to see others in print, and then it kind of keeps you company as well for a while you're juggling what you're going to write. I've got a question about writing in Swahili from Mumbai Hinga, who I might take up offline, but it's an interesting question in a way about, and of course the work I do with Makoma Wangugi on the Mabati-Cornell Kiswahili Prize, asking whether any of you do write in your own languages, in your what might be your kind of mother tongue, if you have one, and what the difficulties are, if there are any, and why you choose to write in English. What, Khadija, go ahead.
Yeah, I knew this question was gonna come. Speaking Kiswahili and writing Kiswahili are very different things. I think, especially if you're not someone who has been educated in like the rules and the grammar of Kiswahili. So while I would love to write in Kiswahili and I would love to read more Kiswahili stories, the way that I have consumed Kiswahili storytelling is through wedding songs. It's through, you know, just general like storytelling here. But like, I don't write in Kiswahili. Maybe in 10, 20 years when I'm become like, you know, I finally devote time to like studying it, I could write in Kiswahili. Or maybe not. But yeah, I feel like I can't English is what I know how to write in, and I can, you know, be very disrespectful, or like, you know, be very funny and interesting and stylistic, like with English, you know, as in we talk about like English as like being decolonized. I don't know, that's a whole other topic. I'm not really, you know, I don't really have a hill to die on in that regard, but I don't want to be as frivolous when it comes to Kiswahili writing, you know. I want to give it its respect if I did write in it. I need to know the rules. I need to know like what are the conventions in this kind of storytelling if I write in it. So no, I don't. The long and short of it is I do not write in Kiswahili. Maybe one day I will.
Okay.
It's interesting. It's interesting because I remember there's an essay that Arundhati wrote about the companionship of languages, and my own understanding of that, my own interpretation, I'm not basing it on the essay, is that there's no point where one language ends and the other language begins. In as much as I'm writing in English, I'm at the same time writing in Kalenjin, and I'm also writing in Swahili because I'm translating these languages into each other. Because even in the conversations that I write, when I'm writing my characters, I write exactly what they're saying because they're not speaking in English. So in as much as I'm writing in English, it's a kind of conversation that would be very stilted if somebody was speaking actual English, but it totally makes sense if they're speaking Kalenjin or Sheng or Swahili. So because all these languages are in me and there's no end to one language and the beginning of the other, when I'm writing in English, I don't feel like I am not writing in Swahili or I'm not writing in Kalenjin or the other languages that I understand. I feel as an artist, I have the ability to incorporate all the languages that I know to write my story in the best way possible.
Yeah, and I think that's what's most important anyway, in the way that stories in English can come across with those intonations, but also, you know, direct quotation. It doesn't have to be translated always. It can just be part of the English, or part of the sort of Kenyanness of the book. Carey, do you have a view on that? What would you say to that?
I mean, I think it's really hard to like get, it's hard enough to get published in English in Kenya or in Africa, but it's very, very spectacularly difficult to get published in, say, like the languages I'm most comfortable, which are like Luo or Sheng. It's just like it's almost impossible. And I think I'm at like that point of not having the energy to construct all the systems that would like support me, because like the fact that like say like the three of us are publishing in English means, one of the things it means that like say you can like get support with the editorial or financial from say Graywolf Press or from like Miles Morland or from like The Guardian. And if I started like writing in Luo, it would be really, really difficult for my writing to like exist. So like at this point, I'm just like, very sadly, don't have the energy to like fight the institutional process that like makes English the dominant language of publishing in Kenya.
Oh, the video. I have to wrap up. I had one more question about genre, and I was thinking actually that, given maybe it's my fault for the curation of the event, that I've chosen three very literary scholars and writers, but genre writing and writing sort of crime or romance. Oh, I'm so sorry, my cat jumped off the computer. Yeah, it's another question a conversation we could have about, and I love the fact that the title of Down River Road is taken from the Major Mwangi book, which was one of my favorites and sort of one of the neglected greats of Kenyan literature. And I love the idea of kind of writing more of those stories as well, the kind of the romance and the mystery and the thrillers and everything else. But unless any of you have a comment on that and whether you have one of those novels up your sleeve, Khadija, what will you be working on next?
I'm writing again on Coast, mostly on food. And you're breaking up. You're talking something about genre writing, but I couldn't quite catch it. What did you say exactly?
Oh, sorry, it's better when my camera is off, I think. Just that there is plenty of genre writing around, I'm sure, but I wondered if any of you were dabbling in that.
Oh, well, I don't know. Genre is interesting. I think sometimes I like not thinking about genre, right? And sometimes I like getting very specific. Right now, I'm not. I have specific projects and I have not specific projects. But at the end of the day, they're all coast informed, which is what I'm working on. What I will say is that I'm reading Kenyan literature a lot now. I'm reading Okuri Odor's recent novel. Even I'm reading Jacob Aliat Shoreline. Which I guess you could really see. It's like kind of like, I think it's like a more like a sci-fi, or it's more like a fantasy, which is interesting. Kind of like looking at more like genre focused kind of like writing and like. But I've been reading mostly, and again I'm writing, but coast focus, food, and the idea of absolute forgiveness and what that means. Yeah.
That sounds like an epic topic. I think our time is up, so I need to wrap up for now. But thank you everyone who joined us, and thank you to Carey and Khadija and Kiprop Kimutai. We look forward to all of your work coming in the future, whether it's from the Rift Valley, from the coast of Mombasa, or from Entebbe and Kampala in the 1960s. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope everyone's enjoyed the conversation so far. Obviously, there's plenty of time to catch up. This will be played on YouTube, and we'll put up the link online so you can watch again. And yeah, keep reading. And thank you so much.